From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. Donald Trump did not want the US government to release the files they had on the dead paedophile billionaire Jeffrey Epstein. And yet,
both chambers of Congress have voted to force the Justice Department to publish files from the investigation into the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
He's been forced into a U-turn by some members of his own movement, some of the loudest and proudest MAGA voices in Congress, like Marjorie Taylor Greene.
I was called a traitor by a man that I fought for 6 years for. Let me tell you what a traitor is. A traitor is an American that serves foreign countries and themselves. A patriot is an American that serves the United States of America and Americans like the women standing behind me.
Is this one political breakup on one issue, or is it emblematic of a larger schism between Trump and his base? The story today, how the Epstein files split MAGA. At time of recording, George, Donald Trump is about to, at least he said he's going to, sign a bill into law on the Epstein files, the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Before we get into how all of this happened, how consequential a moment do you think this is for Donald Trump?
Well, he suffered a defeat in Congress, and that's kind of sapped his authority a little bit because, make no bones about it, he has been resisting the release of the Epstein files for months and months and months.
George Grylls is our man in Washington, D.C. He has interviewed Marjorie Taylor Greene and he's followed the twists and about turns of the Epstein file drama in Congress.
You know, he could have released these files at any point. It's his decision not to release them up until this point.
And these Epstein files and what is thought to be in them has been a source of fascination for MAGA folk for absolutely ages.
Yeah, and to the extent that it even became a pledge during the election campaign, Trump was asked, are you going to release the files if you get back into the White House? And he committed to doing so. So it's been a major issue for a number of supporters for a fair while because you've got to see the Epstein files and those who have been kind of following it for years. There's a significant overlap with the kind of QAnon conspiracy theorists who were kind of floating around and have been in Trump's orbit for a while. So those same people who were campaigning on other issues kind of migrated to the Epstein files. And then the irony is that this is becoming a big problem for Trump himself.
And one of those people who has been banging the drum about the Epstein files and who in the past I think has flirted with the QAnon conspiracy is Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Tell us about her. Who is she? Where does she come from?
So Marjorie Taylor Greene is a politician from Georgia. She is basically kind of got into politics later in life. She used to own gyms.
CrossFit, wasn't she?
She was big into CrossFit, exactly. So she's not, a creature of the swamp, as she would call it. And she's kind of set herself in opposition to the kind of politicians in DC. And she came there really to ruffle feathers. And she has been a kind of Trump loyalist from the get-go. And her conversion into politics really came through the internet. She spent a lot of time on forums. She was kind of well-versed in the QAnon and Pizzagate conspiracy theories.
And just explain what those are, sorry, for anyone living under a rock.
These are kind of conspiracy theories that there is a network of paedophiles who are, in control of the government, who are running the world.
QAnon first emerged in the months after President Trump took office, starting on fringe internet message boards before spreading to social media. Adherents allege, among other things, that the president is the target of so-called deep state actors, high-ranking officials plotting against him.
And Trump he's almost elevated to this kind of figure of a resistance fighter who's trying to upset and tackle this network of pedophiles, protect the world, almost like a kind of superhero in a comic book or something. And, Marjorie Taylor Greene was a kind of believer in this stuff originally. And that's how she came to be a kind of Trump acolyte.
When did she actually become a politician?
So she was elected in 2020, which was, of course, the election that Trump lost. And this was kind of Trump's nadir, because if you think about what happened after the election in 2020, there was January the 6th and the kind of attempted insurrection. And she was one of the voices who was prominently defending Trump.
You can't allow it to just transfer power peacefully like Joe Biden wants and allow him to become our president, because he did not win this election. It's being stolen and the evidence is there.
And has kind of always insisted that he didn't do anything wrong on January the 6th. As she sees it, when others were abandoning Trump, when the kind of more traditional Republicans, rhinos as they were called, Republicans in name only, were kind of turning against Trump and abandoning him because they had concerns about January the 6th or about his more general conduct. She stood by him. She was there at his lowest ebb. She stood by him through thick and thin. And yet she hasn't been rewarded for that loyalty in a number of ways. Firstly, she didn't get an appointment in the administration when others with equally colourful biographies were elevated to kind of Trump's top table. And then more recently this year, she had ambitions to run for the Senate in Georgia, become one of two senators there. And Trump basically vetoed it because he didn't think she would win. And since that point, she has been on something of a rampage and a political conversion, and has basically turned against Trump, her former mentor.
And you've met her. What do you make of her? On the television, she seems quite combative, can be quite angry, but recently it seems sort of like she's mellowed and just seems disappointed.
Yeah, when I went to see her, she was still very close to Trump. This was in the summer, and she actually had a hamper of presents from him. And I, being the inquisitive journalist that I am, was trying to work out what Trump had given her, and she was having none of it and saying, I can't breach his confidence like that. I think it's important to understand her as being very Southern. She's from Georgia. Some of the snacks in her office, I remember there were kind of peaches, pecans, as they call them over here. She has become famous for these instances where she has these clashes with journalists. She told David Cameron through a journalist to kiss my ass at one point. I think she told Emily Maitlis to, I'm not sure if I can say this, you might have to bleep it, but to fuck off. But, I asked her about these instances. I said, how important were kind of Southern manners, this genteel hospitality that is the caricature of the South to her? And she said, yeah, she had this traditional Southern upbringing. It was very important to kind of look proper, be dressed nicely. And yet her kind of online persona contrasts with this Southern upbringing that she had, which I think is quite interesting. And I think another kind of important part of her personal politics is the effect of the Iraq War. And she was talking with me about seeing American soldiers come back injured and then eventually becoming disillusioned with American interventionist foreign policy. And that has become another major dividing line with Trump, because her credo is make America great again and America first. That American voters have been ignored too long by politicians in DC. And she thinks it's a betrayal of the America First movement, which should be concentrating on voters closest to home.
Trump will have had some common cause with that. But in terms of the big schism that we've seen now, as you say, he is obviously the patron saint of all these MAGA voters. She is the sort of MAGA voter made flesh. When did the cracks between her and Trump in this big, arguably fatal split between the two of them actually start to show first?
Well, she basically rebelled on this Epstein bill. As I said earlier, Trump had pledged to release the Epstein files once he got into office.
Would you declassify the Epstein files?
Yeah, I would.
All right.
Yes, I would.
Earlier this year, when the DOJ, the Department of Justice, said, actually, we're not going to do that, join this rebellion. And she teamed up with Democrats in Congress, basically kind of create this bill to legislate to force Trump to release the files.
Explain for us how this really started to grow on Trump and how people like Marjorie Taylor Greene really started to put the pressure on Trump on this issue, because he's not somebody who is a pushover, is he? What kind of pressure were they putting on him?
No, and up until this point, Trump has had an absolute total grip on the Republican Party in Congress. They have not defied him. And it was Marjorie Taylor Greene who kind of spearheaded this rebellion that succeeded in basically defeating him. And this is unusual for Trump at this stage. If we think that he came onto the political scene about 10 years ago in 2015, since that point, he has refashioned the Republican Party in its own image. Anyone who has attempted to defy him has basically been cut down pretty brutally. So for Marjorie Taylor Greene, once his most loyal lieutenant, to now have kind of led the rebellion that has taken the Republican Party away from Trump is really fascinating. And, there were other Republicans in Congress who were willing to basically sacrifice their reputation to defend Trump and try and stop the release of the files. And key among them was Speaker Mike Johnson. He basically refused to swear in a Democratic congresswoman who had been elected for weeks and weeks and weeks, citing the shutdown. But I don't think many people bought that, because it was basically because she had threatened to provide the pivotal signature on a petition to force a vote on releasing the files. And you were in this kind of bizarre situation where you had an elected member of the House of Representatives unable to take a seat, basically because Republicans were trying to delay a vote on the Epstein files. Anyway, once the shutdown ended, Johnson didn't really have much of a choice. And it was at that point Trump suddenly kind of changed his tune and says, oh yeah, fine, we'll release the Epstein files. But that was basically an acknowledgement of the fact that he couldn't hold it up anymore.
George, we're talking about the about face that Donald Trump has had to do on this whole question of releasing the Epstein files, the files that the federal government have on Jeffrey Epstein, and how he's been sort of forced into that by people on his own side. But in all of that, there is this enormous split between Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene, which starts with him calling her Marjorie Traitor Greene. How does that go down?
Funny enough, not particularly well. He kind of... this is Trump, so this is not just one attack. It's an absolute series of blistering fusillades that he posts on Truth Social. He also says she's a ranting lunatic at one point, and says that she's calling him at all times of the day and he can't pick up. It's a pretty explosive attack on MTG, as she's known. And she says, I'm not a traitor. And actually, over the weekend, she's actually said this has led to kind of death threats against her and plots to attack her.
This is the latest post that's gone out. She says, quote, I am now being contacted by private security firms with warnings for my safety as a hotbed of threats were made against me. Now I have a small understanding of the fear and pressure the women who are victims of Jeffrey Epstein must feel.
She says her life could be at danger because of the rhetoric.
Her life is in danger? Who's that?
Marjorie Taylor Greene, she says.
Marjorie Taylor Greene. I don't think her life is in danger. Frankly, I don't think anybody cares about her.
It's all gone pretty grim pretty quickly. But I think it was something that had been coming for a while, because she had obviously been defying him on the Epstein stuff, and that is the most sensitive element for her to kind of rebel on. But she'd also been talking out on various other issues. She'd been talking about cost of living. She'd been kind of criticizing Trump's support for Israel and the intervention in Iran. She had been criticizing also the H-1B visas, which are the visas for high-skilled professionals that Trump has said the US still needs. She talked about the high cost of healthcare for Americans. So in lots of different ways, she had been basically not towing the line. But of course, the Epstein stuff and campaigning for the release of the Epstein files is the most severe criticism she could really give of Trump.
And just a point on that before we talk about the wider schism. Why is it the Epstein story which seems to bristle with Trump so much? We've seen in the last few days him being very snappy with reporters when they ask him about Epstein.
President, why wait for Congress to release the Epstein files? Why not just do it now?
It's not the question that I mind, it's your attitude. I think you are a terrible reporter.
From what we understand at the moment, yes, he was friends with Epstein back in the day, but it seems genuine that they fell out. It seems very unlikely that there is much that's incriminating for Trump. Trump has denied all the way through this that he saw anything illegal or any hint of all the awfulness that we know that Jeffrey Epstein was up to. So why does he seem so touchy about it?
Well, they were friends for a long time, and there are plenty of pictures of them together in the 1990s and 2000s. They were neighbors in West Palm Beach. Remember that Virginia Giuffre, who is the woman who tragically committed suicide earlier this year and is alleged that she was forced to have sex with Prince Andrew a number of times. Sorry, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, as we should now call him. And she was originally recruited by Epstein from Mar-a-Lago, from the spa there. There was a batch of documents released last week by the House Oversight Committee in Congress, and that included further details of the relationship between Trump and Epstein. There was an email where Epstein was writing to Ghislaine Maxwell, his accomplice, and saying that the dog that hasn't barked is Trump. Now, we don't know exactly what that means, but clearly they did have a long friendship. They did split sometime in the 2000s, but Trump was at parties with Epstein around the time of a lot of these accusations.
So that seems to be the straw that has broken the camel's back in terms of his relationship with Marjorie Taylor Greene. But I wonder how emblematic is that of maybe a broader parting of Trump and parts of his base on this Epstein issue, which we know they've been obsessed with for a while, but also some of those other things you mentioned about how immigration is dealt with, visas are dealt with, how the healthcare is going, the government shutdown. Do you think we should read into this that there's a good chunk of Donald Trump's base who might be walking out the door with the likes of Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Not yet, but we're starting to see the signs. And I think the elections earlier this month were pretty interesting because, to be honest, the Republicans did really poorly. The Democrats won so comprehensively in Virginia and New Jersey. There were governor races there. Bear in mind, all the attention was on Zohran Mamdani's win in New York. But actually, I think what is concerning the Republicans is what happened in Virginia and New Jersey. They're only going to back a winner, aren't they? You know, all politicians want to keep their seats. And we have midterms coming up next year. So if Trump performs poorly in the midterms next year, you could see a trickle of support away from in the Republican Party, quickly kind of morphing into something much more serious for him. I think the other really interesting policy area where there is a split on the right is over Israel and the US's support for Israel. And Marjorie Taylor Greene has been one of those questioning that.
And in the past, though, Donald Trump's sheer force of personality has somewhat allowed all of these rough edges to be smoothed over. But do you think part of this is the fact that he will be leaving office soon, some enormous unconstitutional plot to install him for a third term aside, and so this is the party trying to figure out what does it actually look like, MAGA-wise, without Trump?
Well, I think Trump is very conscious of that, and that's why he's equivocated when he's asked, are you going to run for the third term? He said yes, he said no. He now has appeared to rule it out, but he's never kind of quite fully nipped those rumours in the bud. You know, for example, they still sell MAGA caps saying Trump 2028. And part of that is because, you know, your authority as a president does wane towards the end of your second term. And he's desperate to kind of keep the cohesion, keep the MAGA movement together until that point. But you're right, yeah, there is a question as to what comes next, and you're already seeing a bit of jostling between J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio. Ted Cruz in recent days has also appeared to be kind of throwing his hat in the ring. So there is a debate over what is coming down the line, and maybe we're seeing the kind of foothills of it over what comes after Trump for the Republican Party.
Back to where we started, finally, what happens now that both houses of Congress have voted for this bill, which will force the government to release these files. As we're recording this, Donald Trump will be signing it at some point soon. I mean, are we going to see some enormous tranche of documents in the next few days, weeks, months, ever?
Well, it's a good question. Given the fact that he could have released this stuff at any point over the past year, I wouldn't rule out a bit of skullduggery in the coming weeks. But there's another argument that perhaps Trump just, as they call it here, floods the zone. He just releases all the documents at an inconvenient time for people covering it and, you know, hopes that it's a storm that all blows over fairly quickly. But we've seen some files already released, but that's come because the House Oversight Committee which is a committee within Congress, has subpoenaed the Department of Justice and Jeffrey Epstein's estate for certain documents. So that's where you've seen a few flight logs and kind of details about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor that have emerged in recent weeks. That's come from there. But the vast bulk of the information, the reams and reams of evidence from the FBI investigation into Epstein, remain with the Department of Justice. And this is really what Congress was trying to force the release of. So it's passed both houses of Congress now, this bill compelling the Department of Justice to release all of that trove of evidence. So now it sits on President Trump's desk for his signature. Once it's signed, there are 30 days for the government to publish all the documents. So that takes us to mid-December. But there are reasons why they might redact certain documents. You know, the Epstein files are believed to include child pornography. But there's also this interesting clause that basically says if it could jeopardize a federal investigation, then we don't need to release those files. And conveniently, Trump announced a federal investigation into Epstein's links with Democrats at the same time as he said, oh yeah, I'm in favor of releasing the Epstein files. So there's some speculation that he could try and use that as a way potentially to redact documents that he doesn't want to see out there.
George Grylls, Washington correspondent for The Times. You can read more from him over at thetimes.com if you've got a subscription. And do subscribe to this podcast right now for £0 actual, and you'll never miss an episode. That is it from us today. Today's producers were Micaela Arneson and Olivia Case. Sound design was by Tom Birchall. Theme composition was by Micaela Arneson, and the executive producer is Kate Lamble. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.